Welcome, everybody. I'm Kim Hosen with the Prince William Conservation Alliance. And I just want to tell you, I'm going to share my screen for a minute to show you where you can find all our programs here. We have another one on history, which is about Cockpit Point. And then the next one is on February 11th, which is about groundwater and surface water. Some facts about Prince William County and some new rules that the state has enacted to try to help protect our water resources. And we are able to do all these programs free of charge, thanks to the support of people like you. So we hope that you will take a minute and join us, which you can just click here. And it's very easy to do, and you can do that safely. And that's all from that. And we are delighted to have Bill Backus with us, who is a preservationist with Prince William County Department of Historic Preservation. And I'm going to turn the program over to Bill, and he's going to fill us in on some of his background.
All right. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for spending a little bit of your wintry evening with me. I'm really excited that the screen sharing is actually working. I did one program in which my PowerPoint was not working at all. So I was really nervous about that. Again, I'm Bill Backus. I am the preservationist for the Prince William County Historic Preservation Division, part of the Department of Parks, Recreation, and Tourism. Our department is tasked with maintaining and operating all county-owned historic sites. So those range from colonial sites on the eastern end of the county in Woodbridge and Dumfries, to a Civil War hospital in Manassas, to a Civil War battlefield in Bristow, which you guys learned about last week, to the capital for Prince William County, which is in Brentsville, Virginia during the 1800s, and miscellaneous buildings, one of which is the Barnes House, the topic for tonight. I've been with the county for about 11 years, going from historic interpreter to historic site manager, now currently in my position of preservationist. I have a bachelor's degree in historic preservation from the University of Mary Washington. And before working for the county, I was actually quite fortunate to be a seasonal with the National Park Service. First for a summer down in Vicksburg, Mississippi, which was very much of a culture shock because I'm originally from Connecticut. So going from Connecticut to Mississippi was a little different. And then worked for Petersburg National Battlefield for a few years. So very fortunate that I've at least had a third of my career with Prince William County. I'm hoping to get my other 2/3 of my career with the county as well. And so in preparation for tonight's talk, I looked at the definition for conservation from the Oxford Dictionary. And so the number one definition is the preservation of wasteful use of a resource. And so all of you are pretty familiar with the first variation of that definition of conservation, mainly focusing on natural environment or also wildlife. But conservation also deals with the preservation of historic sites. So those range from historic buildings to archaeological sites to historic view sheds. And so you, again, learned a little bit about the preservation of historic resources last week with Julie's talk about the Bristow Station Forest. And so that's a really good segue to show that conservation can incorporate both historic and natural resources. When you're conserving an item, it doesn't have to be one or the other. It's not a zero-sum game. You can conserve both historic and natural resources and vice versa. And so tonight, thank you, we're going to be talking about this building, one of my favorite buildings in Prince William County, Barnes House Historic Site, which is now located in Montclair, Virginia, at the Montclair Community Library. This is a photograph of its dedication in 2019. Feels like 8 generations ago because I'm like freaking out because so many people are sitting right next to each other. It's going to take me a while to get used to sitting in crowds. And so this building is very unique. I think it's a great success story for preservation in general, but especially for preservation for stories that historically haven't been maintained both in Prince William County and the nation as a whole. And so what we're going to do tonight is we're going to explore the Barnes House and its story of both restoration, preservation, and its history through a couple different lenses. Unfortunately, no diaries or letters survive from any of the families who actually resided in that building for over 200 years. So hopefully it's not going to be a little bit too dry, but we do want to dive into some of the history that actually took place in this building. And so before we really get into details, I want to show where this building was historically. And you see, this is an insert of a historic map from 1901. And we have zoomed in on the Independent Hill area. And basically dead center in your screen, there's a little dot that says E.L. Barnes. Now that is the location for the Barnes House. The Barnes House is named after the African-American family who lived there from the 1880s, 1890s, all the way up to the 1940s, 1950s. And it was originally in the Independent Hill area on that main Dumfries to Manassas Road, one of the major east-west roads in our county. And what's neat about this map, again, it's over 120 years old, but you can see some of the general roads really haven't changed too much. So E.L. Barnes, that is on the Dumfries Road, today 234. You can see Independent Hill, where it splits, where it goes straight north, that's 234. Where it goes off to the upper left-hand corner, that's Bristow Road. The road that goes by the two Taylor farms, that's Aiden Road. And the road that goes down by the poorhouse, that's Joplin Road. So a lot has changed in Prince William County in 200 years. The roads have changed a bit, but there are still a lot of these remnants of Prince William County history still there today. Now, to give you a little bit better sense of historically where it was, this is a aerial photograph of the area in 1937, one of the earliest that we have. And it's going to be kind of hard to see, but if you take the center of your map, you see we have an overlay for the modern roads. You see the modern cul-de-sac. It basically parallels the historic Dumfries Road. If you go maybe about 2 or 3 inches to the right of that cul-de-sac, you see maybe a little building. That's the Eppa Barnes house in 1937. And this map is a good representation of the initial challenges for preserving this building, because in the early 2000s, Dumfries Road was being converted into 234, the road that we know today. And you can see that the Barnes House sat right in the right of way for westbound 234. And so generally, historic homes that are in the right of way of transportation projects typically aren't preserved. Added to it, this is what the Barnes House looks like about 20 years ago. So a house that is more or less decrepit and abandoned right on a major road network improvement usually isn't a top candidate for preservation. That's an exterior from the front. That's the inside of the Barnes House. But fortunately for us today, for preservationists, visitors, and residents in Prince William County, local stakeholders in the area knew of the history of the house, or at least portions of the history. They knew that an African-American family lived in that house right after the Civil War. They knew it was a pretty unique story, and so they wanted this building preserved. And so they were able to convince the Board of Supervisors at the time to direct county staff to do a feasibility study to see how much it would be to move the building and mothball it for future restorations. And so we were actually able to do that. We picked up the Barnes House and we moved it adjacent to the Prince William County landfill right on the intersection of Bristow Road and 234. And this is how that building looked for about 10 years when it was mothballed. And you can see it's very creepy. We have a lot of vultures, a couple crows on it. So this building was preserved when it was moved from its original location. But preservation itself was not the ultimate goal. We wanted this building to be restored and accessible to the public. And so when the two newer libraries, the one at the Gainesville Haymarket area and the one in Montclair were approved, part of those libraries also had two historic houses. So the Montclair Library has this building, the Barnes House, and the one in Gainesville Haymarket has another historic building from the 1790s called Bushy Park. And so both of these historic buildings were incorporated into those library projects. And so in 2014, now getting close to over 6 years ago, the building was literally put on the back of a truck and driven down 234, about 6 miles to Montclair. And so what's really neat about this is the road that was potentially going to demolish this building is the road that actually saved this building. And the building will use this road to its final location for its restoration. So the history of 234 and Barnes House is really intertwined pretty heavily. So it was driven down 234 about 5 o'clock in the morning to avoid traffic. And you can see in this great picture, the building is just too tall for the power lines. And so we had to have some bucket trucks lift the power lines. Power lines were not a problem. When we hit the traffic lights, those traffic lights could not be moved up. And so because we did this early in the morning, county police actually shut down 234 for sections because the road was actually going the wrong direction. It was going eastbound on the westbound sections of 234. So it was eventually slowly but surely brought to Montclair. And this is a picture from about 2015 when it was being under restoration. And so we have in this picture a great representation of both the historic fabric of this building and also the modern restoration aspects that we've done. You see a really nice, modern, sturdy foundation. This building is not moving anytime soon. This building, for all intents and purposes, it is in its permanent location, will be for hundreds of years for future generations to enjoy. So we were doing the restoration. And again, when the building was preserved, the post-Civil War history of it was fairly well known. The Barnes family was the most well-known story associated with this particular building. But we wanted to do more research to figure out exactly how old it was, because there was some debate if it was a post-Civil War building, so built after 1865, or was it built some point before the Civil War? And if it was built before the Civil War, exactly when? So those are some questions that we had. We're doing some research, and we were able to find a couple images or potential images of the structure in its original location. And so the image on your top left, that is from the 1930s. During the midst of the Great Depression, one of the New Deal projects, the Workers' Progress Administration, was a project to get people back to work, including historians. And so for Prince William County in 1936, 1937, a historian named Susan Morton went throughout Prince William County documenting the history that she saw. So she took photographs of historic buildings. She talked to local residents to not only get the history of the buildings, but also some of the local stories. So it's a great resource to have. And so it's now actually stored at the Library of Virginia in Richmond. So we were going through these records, and the oral history that Susan Morton has with the Barnes family in the 1930s has this identified as Green Level. So the farm was called Green Level, at least in this report, which raised some questions because this is the only reference we have ever found of this area being called Green Level. Doesn't mean that it never happened, just the only reference that we have for it. And this photograph that is accompanying this report looks like to be Barnes House, but quite honestly, a lot of these structures from the pre-Civil War era are pretty commonly built. And so even though there was an image key, we were about 90% certain that the image above was Barnes House, but we weren't 100% sure. The picture below from the 1950s, we know is the Barnes House. I mean, there is no doubt about it that this is the Barnes House from the 1950s time period. And so when the restoration was taking place, the decision was made that we were going to restore the building to what it looked like in the 1950s, when we know conclusively that this is what the building looked like, rather than potentially an earlier representation, but also a possibility in which we accidentally have restored a building that is misidentified in the historical records. So this is why when you go to the Barnes house today, it's going to look like the picture in the bottom half rather than the top half of the screen. So when we did the restoration, we did a couple techniques to try and identify the building time period. And so these images right here, this shows what's called dendrochronology. And so we actually had a contractor come in, and he took about 12 to 14 samples, wood samples of the wooden frame of the building. So he's drilling into that wood and taking out a section like that, because what you're doing is you're counting the growth rings on the trees. And so with the rings on the trees, compared with historical databases that have been compiled over the years, looking at the width of the tree band with historical records, we can pinpoint when these particular years are being represented on these trees. And so the report shows, well, not 100% conclusive, it shows that most of the timbers that were sampled in this building, those trees started to grow in the 1600s. So the earliest that we have was from 1614, and some trees were beginning to grow in the 1650s and the 1660s. And all of these trees were cut down between 1796 and 1797. So you're not using green wood to build a house. So these timbers were probably cured for a couple of years. So we're looking at this building is constructed between 1798 and 1799. This is about 80 years earlier than most historians thought the construction of this building actually took place. Again, so when the building was preserved, we knew the Barnes family's story. We knew that this building post-dated the Civil War, but we didn't know that this building actually was constructed 80 years before the Civil War. And so dendrochronology really helped pinpoint when this building was constructed. And just to give you a sense of what's going on in 1640, when some of these first trees are growing, Pocahontas marries John Rolfe. And what's interesting is in 1640, there is no European settlement in Prince William County. There is no Prince William County in 1614. So it's interesting that these timbers predate the formation of Prince William County by over 110 years. And because these timbers are being cut down in the late 1790s, even though we have no conclusive historical documentation during the time period in which they were cut down, along with the fact that we are in Virginia, it is more than likely that at least portions of the building, or at least portions of the building materials for the building were constructed with slave labor. And it's more than likely that portions of the building itself was constructed with slave labor as well. So with that dendrochronology in our pocket, we were doing further research, and part of the archival research that we were doing was what's called a chain of title, trying to figure out who bought this building from whom, and going back as far as we can. Now, Prince William can be somewhat problematic because the Civil War is pretty destructive in our community. And one of the destructive elements of this war is the loss of a lot of government records from before 1861. So if you're trying to do research for Prince William County history, it's a hit or miss story if you're trying to find stuff, anything before 1861. Fortunately for us, in this particular building, we were able to find deeds of gift going back to the 1790s. So we have an unbroken chain of ownership for this particular parcel for its duration of its history. And so we know that in the 1790s, the original location was a part of a huge land grant to a Revolutionary War veteran. He got this land as basically payment for his service during the war. And instead of settling on the land himself, instead, he basically allowed someone to be a tenant farmer for life. So he didn't sell the farm. He's basically letting another farmer rent out this portion of his real estate for the lifetime of the particular farmer. And so he builds the structure, which is now known as the Barnes House. And so from the 1790s to about the 1820s, you have different people coming in, renting this property between either a 5-year period. There's a couple families who are living there in about 10 or 15 years. But generally, there's a pretty large or pretty quick turnover for tenants in the Barnes House until the 1830s. Now, during the research, we were able to find, I'm going to go back real quick. Sorry. So during the research, we were able to find the image on your right, which is an inventory for one of the family members who's living there in the 18 teens who's passed away. And so in the 18 teens, the family who's living there is called the Adams family. And we know from other records that they actually apply for a tavern license. So they're basically having a small little hotel in the Independent Hill area. There's no records of them having another structure or another house nearby. So they're more than likely using the house that they're renting in also as a tavern. And the reason why they're probably using the building as a tavern is its location on this main east-west thoroughfare on the Dumfries Road. And legally in Virginia during this time period, if you wanted to sell food to travelers or fodder for travelers' horses, you have to take out a tavern's license. You just can't take a general business license. You are required by law to take out a tavern license. And this also now requires you to have beds in your building so that travelers can spend the night if they want. The flip side of this, though, is this is the only business that can legally sell booze during this time period. So the Barnes House in the 18 teens, it's more or less, in my opinion, a 7-Eleven for Prince William County in the 18 teens. You have a lot of local people going through. They're not going to be spending the night, but they might. And so we know a little bit more about the time period in which it was a tavern from these tavern licenses, but also this inventory that is done of the property after the husband for the Adams family passes away. They actually have to inventory everything in this building. And so this shows, there we go, inserts from the inventory. So you can see there's a lot of stuff in this building. It's a pretty small building. What's wilder are the amount of beds. So again, they are legally required to have beds, but they really went the extra mile. You can see they have one bedstead worth $22. They have three bed sets worth $18, one that's worth $16, and they have a man's saddle that's worth $375. So there's a lot of stuff in this building. But what's most striking in this document, if you go further down, there is an enslaved person. She's described as one old Negro woman named Esther. Her value is $1. Again, you have beds who are worth $20 to $18. You can see a parcel of old lubes and keys at $2, twice the value of a human being. So you can see in this one document the value of a person, of an enslaved person for this time period in this particular area. And unfortunately for us as historians, this is the only reference that we have of Esther. We don't know what happens before her, and we don't know what happens after this inventory. This is the only time that we have been able to identify this particular person. It's a tavern for about 5 or 10 years. And then by the 1830s, it's a private residence. And by the 1850s, it is owned by the family named Copin. So it's a fairly small family. This is a a page from the 1850 Federal Census, and we all took the Federal Census last year. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of information in the current census that we just took, unlike this particular document. So we know basically who's living in a particular house. We know when they were born, what they're doing, how much their estate's worth. And so you can see in this particular snapshot from 1850, at the Barnes house, you have Moses Copen living with his wife Nancy, their daughter Premilia, and also an enslaved man, or excuse me, a free black man named Ezekiel Cole. And so again, we don't have any diaries or letters of these individuals. We were unfortunately left with these fairly bland government documents to try and piece together some of these connections to this particular building. Because what's interesting is we fast forward 10 years to 1860, you can see Nancy Copen is now a widow. Moses has passed away, and her daughter is still living with them. So Premilia is living with Nancy. They don't appear to have any other siblings or children, so it's only two people living in this this house. And you can see, compared to the rest of their neighbors in a value of both personal and real estate, the Copen family are a pretty well-to-do family in the Independent Hill area. If you look above on the census, the only family that comes fairly close to their wealth are the Lynns, and they don't even come actually pretty close to their particular wealth in the few thousands of dollars. What's interesting, though, in this document are the people who are living next door. Ezekiel Cole, who in 1850 is living with the Copen family, is now 10 years later living right next door to the Copens. He is married and he has two daughters. And what's very interesting is his oldest daughter is named Premilia, the same name for the daughter for the Copen family. So what does this mean? Does this mean that the Cole family and the Copen family were close? That's a possibility. There is also the possibility that the Coles were naming children after the Copen family as a way to survive as a free black family in Virginia during the time of enslavement. Because during this time period, if you're a free black in Virginia, you're legally required to carry your freedom paper on you wherever you went and at all times. If you do not have this freedom paper on you, you can very quickly be arrested, thrown in jail, and if you cannot prove your freedom, you have the possibility of being sold into enslavement. If you are able to prove your freedom, you still have to pay the county back for the cost of imprisoning you. And so this might be a way for the Cole family to try and ally with one of the more wealthy families in the Independent Hill area to try and hopefully cope with enslavement in Prince William in the year immediately before the Civil War. But these are not the only people living in the area in 1860. There's another document with the census record, and this is the slave schedule for this area in 1860. And this document is basically all the information that we know of the enslaved people in the area. The information that is on this document shows who is the owner or the enslaver, their age, their sex, their complexion, if they have run away, or if they haven't run away, if they are mentally challenged or not, and the number of enslaved quarters on a particular farm. And so you can see, when we zoom in, the Copen family, they are a fairly large slave-owning family in Prince William County during this time period. They have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 enslaved people, which for other parts of the South during this time period is not a large number, but for Prince William County, 7 enslaved people on one farm is a very large number. And what's interesting is, if you look underneath Premilia Copen, there is an 8-year-old mixed-raced boy. That is Eppa Barnes, who we'll get to in a little bit. But Eppa Barnes is on this slave schedule. And what's interesting, and I did not realize this until I was prepping for this a little bit earlier today, Mary Cole, Ezekiel Cole's wife, is also a slave owner. So again, unfortunately, we don't know the dynamics for this because it wasn't typical. I wouldn't say uncommon, but it wasn't beyond the realm of possibility for African American Virginians to have enslaved people. Generally, though, if that's the case, most Black Virginians are owning family members rather than just regular enslaved people, because after Nat Turner's rebellion in the 1830s, Virginia passes a series of pretty restrictive laws saying basically, if you are able to get your freedom, you are legally required to leave the Commonwealth of Virginia within 12 months. If you do not, you are liable to be re-enslaved. And so a way in for newly freed enslaved people who have the ability to stay in Virginia, because you can get basically a voucher to vacate this law for you. A lot of these individuals, what they're going to be doing is they'll buy their family members, but they won't go through the extra legal process of technically freeing them, because if they free their enslaved family members, that opens up this legal can of worms in which they have to either leave the Commonwealth of Virginia within 12 months or have to apply for a pretty hard to get legal exemption to stay in the Commonwealth. So the situation for Mary Cole is interesting, which hopefully we can find with some further digging. But this is something that I just discovered today, which is really exciting when you start doing this research. When you're just reviewing stuff, you might still find some stuff that you thought you didn't know you were looking for. And so this is an image of some enslaved people, or formerly enslaved people. These are actually freed people in the the Middle Peninsula of Virginia in 1862, around, I think, York County. And so this is a good representation of formerly enslaved people now free. And it's also a good representation of enslaved people in Virginia. In Virginia before the Civil War, the legal status of individuals stemmed from their mother. And so there were many, many cases of enslaved women having children with white men, either willingly or against their will. And all those children are enslaved people. And we don't know Eppa's biological father. It's not listed in his death certificate, but because of his descriptions of him, it is more than likely that he has a white father and a mixed race mother. But because even though he is fairly light-skinned, he takes the legal status of his mother, and so he is born a slave in 1852. He lives the first 8 or 9 years of his life as a slave until the Civil War breaks out. In 1862, the Federal Army comes into Prince William County for the first time in the spring and basically destroys the institution of slavery a full 8 months before the Emancipation Proclamation takes effect. So for Prince William County enslaved people, the arrival of the United States Army destroys the institution of slavery pretty fast. And so when Eppa is around 9 years old, he is now, along with his mother, who is living with the Copen family in 1860 as an enslaved woman, they're now in this weird legal limbo status of no longer an enslaved person, but not technically a citizen of the United States with the passage of the 14th Amendment. So there is this legal question of actually what to do with these individuals. But by the time the Civil War ends with the passage of the 14th Amendment, these individuals are now United States citizens. But there is an effort by many former Confederates to try and recreate slavery as closely as possible, with the expectation that true bondage is not legally accessible anymore. And so this is going to be the slow but tenacious rise of Jim Crow in Virginia and in the South. Part of that rise of Jim Crow sharecropping. And so Nancy Copen, who is the owner of the Barnes House Farm, potentially called Green Level, after the Civil War, she gives a very small portion of her farm to Nancy Copen to be a sharecropper on. And so as a sharecropper during this time period, you're given a small amount of land to farm yourself, but you are using basically other people's seeds to grow crops and also other people's farming equipment to raise those crops. And there is going to be a very strict and very high, proportionally high fee for using all those equipments and seeds. And so it's a way for former Confederates to try and keep the legacy of enslaved labor as close as possible in the immediate post-Civil War years. So Nancy Copen divides her farm into sharecropping areas. And so Eppa Barnes's mother decides to stay as a sharecropper, but not Amanda, Eppa Lee decides to leave. He leaves Prince William County. He's traveling into Western Virginia and into West Virginia to try and find work, to try and find high-paying levels of employment. He sometimes succeeds, sometimes fails, but in the 1870s, he returns to Prince William County, now married. He is married to Amanda Lambert, a pre-Civil War free African-American family in the Gainesville area. And they come back to the Independent Hill area, and they come back to the Barnes house. Permelia Copen has married, and she's living basically across the street in a new farm. And so she leases out the old historic building to the newly married Barnes family, which is very quickly growing with children. So we don't know exactly when the Barnes family start to live in this building, but they likely start to live there in the late 1880s. In the 1890s, when Permelia Copen dies without having any children or heirs, all that property goes into basically receivership, and Eppa Lee Barnes is able to purchase the farm from this estate. So Eppa Barnes buys the farm he was born as an enslaved laborer. He buys the farm that his mother was a sharecropper on. He not only buys the farm, but he also expands it over the years. So you can see the image on your right is basically a deed for Eppa Lee buying more land to expand the farm in the Independent Hill area. Unfortunately for us, we know a little bit about Eppa Lee because he is arrested a little bit. And this is likely as a result of the rise of Jim Crow in Virginia in the post-Civil War era, as a way to try and regulate the actions and livelihoods of African-American people, not only in Prince William County, but throughout the Commonwealth of Virginia. And so Barnes has a couple run-ins with local law enforcement. But for us as historians in 2021, this gives us some more historical documentation that we might not otherwise have. So the rise of Jim Crow is a slow but steady force in Virginia from the 1870s all the way up to the early 1900s. And it culminates here with these guys. Now, before this takes place in 1902, Virginia is now, in the terminology of this period, it's been redeemed. Redeeming means basically the post-Civil War Reconstruction governments that are established both in Virginia and through the rest of the southern states have been abolished by a white supremacist political movement that basically ends with a one-party political rule in southern states, including Virginia. And so a way for the one-party rule to continue in the state of Virginia from the 1880s, 1890s, and the early 1900s is actual voter fraud in elections. There are some interesting stories during this time period. During local elections, the local election officers aren't giving out the ballots. Each political party is actually printing out their own particular ballot. And so if you wanted to vote Republican, you'd have to go to the Republican candidate and get a ticket. If you wanted to vote Democrat, you had to go get a ticket from the Democratic Party. And so the tickets would be different sizes. They might be a different texture. And so you do a blind ballot cast, you throw it in the ballot box. And so in theory, the register of elections, the clerk of the court, when he's pulling out these elections from the ballot box, he needs to be counting them, what's found in there. But what most, or not most, but what many election officials are doing is they're actually finding and feeling which ballot boxes or what ballots have been cast. And if it is for the opposing party, they'll try and wrinkle or conceal those tickets, and in some cases also drop in additional ballots for their party. And so it is not uncommon in local Virginia elections to have voter turnout exceeding 100%. And so this is an embarrassment for politicians for all parties, and so they want to tamp down on the numbers of explicit corruption in Virginia elections. And so there is a convention that is called in Richmond for a new constitution. And so the 1902 Constitutional Convention tries to figure out a way to bring down the rates of voter fraud. The decision that is quickly made, as you can see in this image, all these individuals are white men. And so a way to cement the legacy of Jim Crow is to disenfranchise as many African-American men as possible. And so they try to make the voting rights for African-Americans exceedingly hard to pass. And many of these delegates are actually quite bold in their statements that one of the major purposes for this constitutional convention is the disenfranchisement of African-American voters. And so after this constitutional amendment passes in 1903, African-American votership plummets in some counties 80 to 85% in the next election. It also unintentionally just brings down regular voter turnout by decent turnout as well. So this is going to be a very big moment in Virginia in 1902, 1903. This allows basically Jim Crow to remain in Virginia all the way up to the civil rights movement of the 1950s and the 1960s. But it doesn't legally disbar African Americans from voting. They are constitutionally unallowed to do that because of the 15th Amendment. So this Constitution is trying to make it as difficult as possible. In our collection, we have this book right here. This is a poll book. So to legally vote in Virginia after this Constitution has been passed, and I should mention that this is the only Constitution in Virginia history, I believe, that is not ratified by the voters of the Commonwealth. This is passed and immediately goes into effect without regular Virginians' opinions being voiced for it. But anyway, after this Constitution is passed, if you wanted to vote in Virginia before the election, you actually had to pay for the 3 preceding years a poll tax. So if you wanted to vote in, say, 1924, you had to pay taxes in 1923, 1922, and 1921. If you missed 1 year, you were ineligible, and you'd have to go for that 3-year block again. And you'd also have to pass what is called the Understanding Clause, in which you would be expected to not only prove that you are able to read and write, but also to understand the Constitution of Virginia. And so depending on the clerk, you might be asked a very simple question or you might be asked an incredibly tough question. There is no standardized questions that the clerk has to ask. And so this is a way to try and disenfranchise as many African-American men as possible during this time period. But what's interesting is Eppa Barnes is one of about 8 African-American voters in the Independent Hill area who's able to pass or jump through all these hoops and remains a voter in the Independent Hill area until he dies. Again, in our collection, we have some of these poll books from the 19-teens and 1920s, and we have Eppa Barnes paying his poll tax in 1920, 1921, and 1922, which makes him legally eligible to vote in all elections after, including 1923 and after 1923. And the poll taxes will be deemed unconstitutional during the civil rights movement in the 1950s. What's interesting, though, is Eppa Lee Barnes is able to pay the poll tax and be a registered voter in Prince William County until his death in the 1930s. His children, though, from the records that we have, for whatever reason, aren't eligible to vote. One son, Bernard Barnes, is drafted into the United States Army during World War I. He actually serves overseas in France, serves his country, and when he comes back to Virginia and lives with his family, raising his elderly parents in Prince William County, he is not allowed to vote. For whatever reason, when he tries to pay the poll tax or try to take the understanding clause, unfortunately for him, he is not able to pass and become a registered voter. But Eppa Lee Barnes is able to remain a voter until his death. And he dies in the 1930s, early 1930s. And so this is his death certificate that we have. And again, I alluded a little bit about this earlier. We don't know about his father, because you can see in his birth certificate, everything about his father is unknown. But we do have some great biographical information that we use then to try and pinpoint if this is Eppa Barnes and other government records. So this is his official death certificate, but he's also, when he dies, given a obituary in the local newspaper. And again, this is when Jim Crow is in full effect. So you can see that this obituary is written not basically for African-American readership, but for white readership. You can see towards the middle of the third paragraph, the obituary author, who is more than likely not a Barnes family member, is trying to write stereotypical African-American talk in rural South in the 1920s. And also not only calls him an ex-slave, but also basically calls him, I believe, where I'm trying to find, I just lost it. Well-known, one of the well-known family, well-known in the annals of Prince William. What's interesting is they're not talking really about the Barnes family. They're talking about the Copen family, the family that was enslaving the Barnes family before the Civil War. So even the obituary for Eppa Lee Barnes in the 1930s, the family who initially enslaved him, still gets a fairly decent representation in this obituary. Now, after Eppa Lee dies, and this is a document I actually just found today too, which is kind of neat. I've never seen this before. The property is divided between his surviving relatives. Amanda Barnes still resides in this structure. This is where she's living in 1936, 1937, when Susan Morton comes along as part of this WPA project to get history for Prince William County. What's interesting is this house is actually transferred not to Amanda Barnes after the death of Eppa, but instead goes to Bernard Barnes. So Bernard Barnes is the legal owner for the Barnes house after the war, and he resides there until his death in the 1960s. And then after his death, Basically, no other individual from the Barnes family wants to use this building because by this point, it's a fairly old, fairly small historic building. If you are raising a family, you want to have a larger structure to raise a family in. And so there is not a huge desire from any of the Barnes descendants to live in this building. So it's eventually sold and it's used as an office space or a business space for a couple of businesses on 234 before it's abandoned in early 2000. And one of the reasons that you can see why there might not be many individuals who are particularly jumping at the bit to get this property is because the Barnes family starts to migrate away from Virginia. They're part of what's called the Great Migration. So you can see there are African-American men from the Barnes family moving into Pennsylvania and New Jersey, some into West Virginia, into Washington, D.C., looking not only for better employment, but also better social conditions throughout the United States. So they are part of what's known as the Great Migration, in which thousands of African Americans from the rural South start to congregate in urban northern cities. And so Bernard Barnes, who lives in Prince William County, decides to stay to take care of his mother, and does not join his brothers as part of the Great Migration up to New Jersey or Pennsylvania. So this is why he resides in Prince William for the rest of his life, and we don't know why, but he remains a bachelor for the rest of his life. He has his sister and a couple of brothers live with him. He has some of his nieces and nephews live with him as well in the Barnes house. But Bernard never marries and never has any children of his own. And you can see this is a great historical document that we have. And unfortunately, hopefully it still survives. We just haven't found it yet. The Barnes family Bible has the genealogical information for all the Barnes family people. So this is actually the death certificate for one of the Barnes brothers when he's residing in New Jersey during the midst of World War II. And as part of the process of creating a death certificate, they have to do some genealogy. And they found that because there's no technical birth certificates issued when he was born in Virginia, that they were able to find get a statement about his birth date being recorded in his family's Bible. And so for the Barnes family, it's a fairly unique story. You have an African-American family who is, or at least the father who is born in slavery in this building in the decade before the Civil War, coming back to the area which he was enslaved and actually buying the farm and also prospering. But this is also a good representation of what's happening in the South immediately after the Civil War. There is a time period for a few decades from the late 1860s into the 1870s in which formerly enslaved African Americans can actually prosper pretty well in southern states. But with the rise of Jim Crow, even if they can keep their own economic and social status intact, they are not able to pass that along to their children. And so this is one of the reasons likely that Bernard Barnes is not able to vote, even though he served his country in World War I, and why eventually most of the Barnes family decide to travel to cities in the north for better social conditions and also better work conditions. But what's interesting again is the fact that this building, it looks like this in 2000, because of the story for the Barnes family was so unique, of a family that was once enslaved coming back and buying the farm they were enslaved, needed to be preserved. And because of the role of local stakeholders, local conservationists, local preservationists, wanting this story to be preserved and told not only to future generations of Prince William residents, but also visitors from throughout the United States, this building was moved and preserved and is open to the public today. And later this month, we'll have actually 2 very small open house tours. It's reservation required because we're very trying to limit the amount of people who are in that space at one time. But you can actually visit the Barnes house this month and hopefully after COVID pretty easily anytime you want. And how we have it set up now today is we have a couple snapshots. We have a room in the back that talks about the preservation and restoration of this building, why this building is in its location today, the story of the preservation of it, and then also two snapshots. There's one room that is set up as a tavern in the 18 teens, and then we have a snapshot 100 years later in the 19 teens when the Barnes family is living there right after Bernard Barnes returns from World War I, returns from France back to rural Virginia, and what he has to deal with in Virginia in the 1920s during the roaring 1920s in Prohibition. So that is what you can see if you visit Barnes house today. If you have any questions, here's my contact information. I'll be here for any questions that you have right now, but if you are thinking about this presentation or just generally thinking about this history later tonight or tomorrow or next couple of days, and you have a question that you'd like to know the answer for, please feel free to shoot me an email or give me a call. And so again, with that, I have a tendency to ramble on, but it looks like I did a talk under an hour, which is basically a record for me. So I'm pretty proud of myself. But with that, I thank you for spending an hour of a nice wintry evening with me, and I'm here for any questions that you might have.
Thank you. I think actually that there's some interesting conversation in the chat.
Okay.
And I would actually like to start off by asking about Green Level Plantation. And the reason of interest is at Merrimack Farm Wildlife Management Area, there's an abandoned cemetery where the headstones that remained showed the family was named French. We had an archaeologist, Jeff Irwin, who helped to restore the cemetery and did a history of the area and said that Merrimack Farm was part of Green Level Plantation.
Okay.
Does that make sense? It's a distance away.
Mm-hmm. It's a distance away, but it's not unusual for Prince William landowners to have large sections that are not contiguous to one another. This is a little bit earlier, but during the colonial time period, the Blackburn family, who's residing in the Woodridge area at Ripon Lodge, they own large sections of what is now Yorkshire and along Route 28. So there is historical documentation for Prince William farmers owning large sections of farms in western and central Prince William County, even if they live in the eastern end, or own sections in the eastern, even if they live in the western end. So, so I wouldn't be surprised if there is a connection with Green Level in the Barnes house. I bring up the Green Level for the Barnes house is because this is the only historical documentation that we have ever found for this. Is this interview that Susan Morton did. And Susan Morton did a pretty good job. She recorded a lot of stories that would not have survived without this work, but she very much is a product of her time and her society. And so she is focusing on more elite stories and kind of also in a couple of cases, basically creating a bigger story out of really something that really wasn't there, because with subsequent research, we were able to basically figure out that story that she told was bunk. So this is the only reference that we ever have of this area being called Green Level. And we do know that Merrimack Farm was called Green Level. That raised a couple questions because like, that's not a pretty close distance from Independent Hill. Did Susan Morton mess up? Is this image misidentified? Is this oral history misidentified? But she's very, very clear that she's talking to Amanda Barnes. And we know from other historical documentation that Amanda Barnes does not leave the Independent Hill area. So she's not living by the Merrimack Farm in the 1930s when Susan Morton's coming through Prince William doing these oral histories. She's right in the Independent Hill area. So
Well, the cemetery, the graves are in the 1800s.
1800s? Okay.
And there is a report. I'm sorry, I can't remember more of it, but I will be glad to share that with you.
Okay.
Because that's interesting because he was very sure. And
Mm.
the cemetery is now called Green Level Cemetery. So do you have a map or guesses as to what the borders of Green Level were?
So we have in historic deeds, we do have like deed maps that show the boundaries of parcels. The problem, especially when you're starting going into historic deeds, is they're referencing trees or fence lines for the boundary markers. And so it's very hard sometimes to try and figure out where this property line begins, because they'll say basically at this large oak tree, 50 yards up is where it starts to cross. And so you have these maps, but it's really hard to try and start to overlay these on modern maps because a lot of these reference points for the original plots have disappeared in the subsequent decades. For the Barnes family, they have a farm about 200 acres, which during this time period is actually a fairly sizable farm in the late 1900s, or excuse me, the late 1800s, early 1900s.
Thank you. Anybody else? There's some interesting conversation in the chat if you want to respond to anything there.
Question for Bill?
Yes.
So the Barneses are there on what is now 234. Are they likely to be shopping down at Batestown and down in what's now Prince William Forest Park, or would they be doing their business in Manassas? And how welcome were they in the business community of Manassas?
So there's one image that we have that I haven't included because there is some question if this is an actual correctly identified image, but there's an image from like late 1920s, early 1930s of the Keyes family for Independent Hill, which was a white family, and an individual that was identified as a Barnes family member, but there's a question mark next to Barnes. We don't know if that's Barnes or not, but they're very light complexioned. With the historical records from the census records showing that they're mixed race. They are very fair skinned, so I think they would have the ability to shop in Manassas pretty easily because they are so light complexion they could pass, especially with some of the family members deciding to go further north. I think this is an opportunity for some of the Barnes family members to particularly pass as white Virginians the farther you went from Prince William. Because of their social standing, being able, or at least for Eppa Barnes, being able to vote and being fairly prosperous farmers in the Independent Hill area, they would likely have had no issue in going with like Kohl's store in the Independent area, shopping there, or going to Manassas. They could have gone to the Batestown area. I would wager, though, that if they went down to that area, they'd more than likely be going into Dumfries itself rather than the African-American section at Batestown. But unfortunately, we have no historical documentation. So this is basically just a best historical guess with other historical events that we know that took place both in Virginia and in Prince William County.
You're the expert. I'll go with your guess. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Any other comments, questions? Even if you wrote them in the chat, feel free to repeat them now for all of us.
Bill, I'd like
Yeah.
to know where we registered for the open house.
So if you go on pwc.gov.org/history, you'll be able to find a program of events, and that should give you a link to register for the open house in February.
So how about we send that So,
Right.
Bill, you could send it to us and we'll send it out in our follow-up.
That's actually a lot easier. So
Yeah, and you can just
That's a lot
click and
easier.
go.
Yeah.
Jimmy, were you getting ready to ask a question? No.
Kim,
Yeah,
I have a question.
of course.
I'm just fascinated by the influence of citizen advocates for creating change. And it sounds like this was pushed by a community that understood the importance of this story. So I'm kind of curious to hear a little bit more about if you have any more information, Bill, about the advocacy of whatever community group it was that made sure that we have this story to appreciate today.
So a lot of this was actually the effort from really just one individual, Lillian Gaskin. So she was an African-American woman who was instrumental not only in the preservation of this particular building, but also the preservation of Lucasville. Lucasville is an African-American one-room schoolhouse that was a school from the 1880s to the 1920s. It was then converted into basically a farm shack. And in the early 2000s, when that farm was going to be developed, she knew that this building was once an African-American school and she wanted it preserved. And so was able to convince not only the local board of supervisors at that time, but also some other preservationists and also staff members that this was a structure that had a unique story. So she was able to get the Lucasville School preserved, and also was able to help get Barnes House preserved. And so the Virginia Department of Transportation had no problem with this building being preserved. And I believe Brennan Hannafin, who was the old historic preservation division manager, he's now the division manager for planning for parks. I think he bought Barnes House from VDOT for like $2 or $1 or something like that. But then the county had to move it fairly fast. And so this was one of the issues that we had with the preservation of it, was there was a very short time period in which we were able to not only stabilize the building, but also to move it to its mothball location. And so unfortunately, because there was a pretty significant time crunch, we had to demolish an addition on the back. Because there were some questions about when that addition was put on. Was it original or was it put on at some point later? And so the decision was made to preserve what we knew was the most historic element of that building, and then to reassess later on if that addition was put on in a relatively decent time frame after the original construction of the building. So so when the building was moved to its current location at Montclair, the decision was made to reinstall that addition that was torn down about 15 years earlier. But unfortunately, just with the deterioration of that element in the back and also the time crunch, it wasn't able to be preserved. But Lillian was helpful in getting that building preserved, and she was also very much an advocate for the preservation of, or at least the oral history of, like, the areas of Batestown, which is the African-American section for Dumfries. Was able to get the Prince William County Historic Commission to do a couple oral histories, I believe, in the early, I think late 1980s. I might be misspoken for that. Might have the date wrong, but
So we really owe her a debt of gratitude, it sounds like, for her her advocacy, and I'm glad she was successful. I hate to think of how many other historical buildings we have lost without people, knowing the history. So we should be thankful and should really do a lot more of that kind of preservation in this county. So thank you.
You're welcome. And what's really neat is they knew this story, and not typically, but sometimes even buildings that have this type of history still are demolished in projects that involve transportation development or other types, because it's for good or worse, most historic buildings that are preserved are for elite individuals. So when you think about a historic building that's preserved, especially for a museum, it's Mount Vernon or Montpelier. It's the McMansions of history. But to have a regular person's house preserved typically isn't that common, and to have a regular person's house who was enslaved at one point and then bought the house is very, very rare. So yeah, we were very fortunate that we had some stakeholders in the early 2000s who knew the history of this building and knew the need for it to be preserved and open for future generations.
Okay, any more comments? Or historical resources that you're aware of that we can get Bill to go out and protect them for us? That works too. Thank you so much for coming.